Some Pokemon are hard to keep because they are expensive, either to get or expensive to feed. Or they can be hard to keep because they're simply hard to find, like the pseudo-legends. And then there are those that are just hard to keep because of their biology, and how their enclosure needs to be set up. Sandshrew and Sandslash are those of the latter category. They are so highly specialized that they don't do well when outside of that environment. But we will get deeper into that later in the guide. Hello and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, a series where we go through different Pokemon species and learn how to properly care for and house them. This time, we'll be talking about the desert mouse Pokemon Sandshrew and its evolution Sandslash. As the names and the slight description suggests, these Pokemon are ground-type Pokemon that live in hot, desert-like areas of the world. Sandshrew is a 2-foot-tall rodent Pokemon weighing an average of 26 pounds, with a brown-tan color that covers its upper body, while its underbelly is cream in color. Its back also looks like dry, hard, cracked soil, and it has large black eyes and small claws on its paws. When it evolves into Sandslash, it jumps up a foot in height and gains quite a bit of weight, averaging around 65 pounds. It honestly doesn't change too much in appearance, still having the same rough body shape. The biggest difference are that its back, which previously looked like the dried out dirt, now is covered with large spines that the Pokemon uses for defense. And the claws on its paws have gotten much, much larger, now being used for slashing instead of mainly for digging. Pretty formidable looking, but I'll show you that it isn't as scary as you think. Let's get into the guide and figure out if the Sandshrew line are the perfect Pokemon for you. Enclosure. So, the habitat of the Sandshrew line can get fairly confusing. And there isn't a better example than looking at the Pokedex entries for this line. It's clear that these are desert-dwelling Pokemon, as they are very intolerant of water, they prefer to dig into hard, dry soil or sand with their claws, and they're clearly designed to blend in with the desert environment. But there are reports of Sandslashes climbing trees and eating fruit, and even attacking from and sleeping in the trees themselves. So what gives? Well, it goes back to the history of the species a little. See, the Sandshrew line are originally from a desert environment. Not sure which one though. But since they are built to survive in such a harsh environment, they became very good at survival in general, no matter what environment they're in. After all, that's how we got the Alolan versions of these Pokemon. To escape a volcanic eruption, these Pokemon migrated from the desert area and gradually moved to the colder regions of Alola, slowly changing to adapt to the cold. So when people brought Sandshrew to regions where there is no desert environment, like Kanto, they survived and adapted just fine to grasslands and the drier forest areas. And that's where reports of them climbing trees comes from. And that brings me back to the enclosure. Like I said, they really can survive in any environment that isn't too damp, so no riversides or marshlands. But their natural and best environment is the desert. There's less water and it helps with their spines and claws. So that's how I'm going to describe their enclosure. Now, if you live in a hot desert sandy area, like Route 11 in Hoenn or near the desert resort in Unova, then you could honestly keep your Sandshrew or Sandslash outside. They'll make burrows in your yard, so heads up about that, but it would be the simplest way to do it. And since they really only leave their burrow to look for a mate, bask in the heat, or to attack prey, you really don't have to worry about them wandering off too much. But if you don't live in any of those places, then you'll need to build your Sandshrew an enclosure. It's going to have to be sort of a greenhouse to keep in the heat that your Pokemon will need. It should be tall enough for you to enter and walk around. That way you can go in and fix any problems that might occur inside. Temperature-wise, the inside of the enclosure should average about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, or 26 degrees Celsius if you aren't from Unova. As for the dimensions, you'll want about 100 square feet of space for each foot in length of Pokemon. So it would be about 100 square feet for the average Sandshrew and 300 for a Sandslash. I would get the 300 right from the beginning, that way you don't have to remodel when your Pokemon is getting ready to evolve. Plus, I'm sure your Sandshrew won't mind the extra space when it's younger. A bigger enclosure is seldom a bad thing. But it's not just about the area that the enclosure covers. Since these Pokemon burrow and create tunnels for a nest, you'll need to give them plenty of space to dig that burrow. So the ground should be about 8 to 10 feet deep, giving them plenty of space to make their burrow. So that is 10 feet of soil, along with another, let's say, 10 feet of greenhouse, which has to cover 300 square feet of space. It's going to be a big enclosure. You'll also want a dry and sandy soil, but not too sandy that their burrows collapse on them. Add in a few desert plants like cacti or tough grasses for decoration, and that should be your enclosure all set up. Another thing to consider is that Sandshrew and Sandslash are very solitary Pokemon. They don't really interact with other Pokemon aside from hunting or fighting, so putting other Pokemon, even other Sandshrew evolutions, in with your Sandshrew won't really be a welcome development. That's how solitary these Pokemon usually are. That being said, if you do want to keep other Pokemon in the enclosure with them, another Sandshrew or non-predatory ground type wouldn't be a terrible idea, like Hippopotas or Baltoy. The types to avoid are bug and water types. Sandshrew predate on bug types, so putting them together will just lead to trouble, and water Pokemon might be the worst type to even put with a Sandshrew. It'll absolutely hate the moisture, and with the drier environment of the enclosure, your water type won't be enjoying itself either. Honestly, it's best just to keep your Pokemon by itself to avoid any complications. Plus, if you do add in any other Pokemon, you'll have to increase the size and dimensions of the enclosure, as it was only designed to accommodate one Sandshrew line. Availability. Sandshrew and Sandslash are not hard to get a hold of, depending on where you live. If you live in Kanto, then you can just check out any of the western routes, mostly around Cerulean City, or in Mount Moon. But keep in mind, always be careful when cave exploring, and always go with a buddy. In Hoenn and Unova, you may have to take a trip if you want to catch a wild one, since they're only available on Route 11 in Hoenn and the Desert Resort in Unova. But if you can get there, then they are fairly common. The same with Johto, actually. They only appear in Union Cave near Azalea Town, but if you can get to Goldenrod City, they actually give them away as prizes at the game counter. Granted, that is very expensive unless you're good at the games. Not sure if I totally agree with giving Pokemon away to random people who are good at gambling, but they do it, so it's an option for you. All in all, there are options all around if you're willing to travel for them. As for breeders, they aren't too common of a Pokemon to breed. Housing one is not too big a deal, but building a big enough enclosure to house a breeding population can get kinda pricey. There are some breeders out there that do invest the money into it, and then there are the breeders that just live near desert areas and raise them in their yards. So they aren't too rare that you'll have a hard time finding one. It just may take a few online searches, some phone calls and emails, and you should be able to get a hold of a breeder. Care. Like I said earlier, these Pokemon are highly adaptive. Technically, they are omnivores, but that really depends on the environment they're in. If they're in their natural desert environment, then they really only eat meat, which consists of passing bug Pokemon. But when they were introduced to Kanto and Johto regions, it was observed that they would eat any fruit that they were able to get a hold of, as well as any bug Pokemon. So you could feed these Pokemon either fruit, meat, or a mixture of the two. I would go with the pure meat diet for a few reasons. One is that the shell outer carapace of bug Pokemon provides needed nutrients and minerals that help the Sandshrew grow healthily. Two is that with the fruit, it could end up providing too much moisture to your Pokemon. With the juice or water content of berries, your Sandshrew or Sandslash could end up taking in too much moisture and end up becoming unhappy. Or, if it stays wet too long, then it could end up becoming sick. With the bug meat, you'll get some water content in it, especially if you use a frozen thawed meat, but it won't be anywhere near the same amount that it would get from berries. I would recommend Dwebble meat, as it's closest to its natural prey, but those can get kind of expensive if you don't live in the regions where there are wild populations. There's not a lot of people breeding and selling dwebble out there. So if dwebble is too expensive for you, then other simpler feeders like caterpie or scatterbug might be more cost effective. Either way, you want to give them about a pound of meat every day, divided between 2 different meals. Just be sure to leave the shell or carapace on the food for your sandshrew, as that will supply them with needed minerals and supplements. Sandslash, with its increased weight and size, you'll be doubling the amount to 2 pounds of food every day. You can use the same kind of meat as before, so there shouldn't be any issues with the food when evolution eventually happens. Going back to something that I mentioned a few times in this guide, moisture level is going to be a big part of your care for these Pokemon. Not only in the enclosure, but also how hydrated the Pokemon itself is. Since these Pokemon are originally from a desert region, there really isn't a need to give them access to abundant amounts of water. They actually get most of their water from their food, and once they take that in, they retain that water very well. So if you were to give them something like a water dish, then it would just sit there until it evaporates in the heat. More than that though, you'll need to keep an eye on your Pokemon's behavior. Sandshrew and Sandslash should be spending a lot of time inside their burrow, hiding away. If they come out, they should spend a bit of time exploring, looking around, and then head back into their burrow. But one of the reasons that it would stay out of its burrow for an extended time is if the Pokemon has too much water saturation. It'll find the warmest, driest place that it can and lay there so that it can dry out. While it does have a system to deal with oversaturation, you'll still want to avoid it happening too often to this Pokemon. It can lead to multiple kinds of illness that will require a trip to the Pokemon Center to deal with. If you do notice that your Pokemon is becoming overhydrated quite often, here are a few things you can do to try and stop it before it gets to a Pokemon Center visit. Make sure that the environment of the enclosure has a very low humidity level. If you have your Pokemon living in the greenhouse-esque enclosure, then water can sometimes evaporate and get trapped in the air, which will cause a rise in humidity. A dehumidifier set up inside the enclosure should pull that water out of the air and help bring things back down to a reasonable level for your Pokemon. As well, when you feed your Pokemon the thawed meat, use a towel to dab off any excess moisture. Because of the frozen nature of the meat, you'll be getting a lot of water content when you thaw it out. So getting rid of any excess water on the outside of the meat should help keep the amount of water that your Pokemon ingests down while still letting them get water from their food. If you've done both of these methods and your Pokemon is still trying to dry itself off in the heat, then your enclosure may not be warm enough. Double check to make sure that the temperature is stable at the temperature that I recommended in the enclosure section. If it is, then try offering a warmer spot somewhere in its enclosure, either by giving it a heated rock or a heat lamp. That way your Sandshrew and Sandslash will naturally go there to dry itself out, and it can leave the increased heat if it needs to. If, even after that measure, your Pokemon is still spending a lot of time trying to dry itself out, then it's time to take your Pokemon to the Pokemon Center. That can be an indication of some kind of inability to rid itself of excess water, which, again, could lead to health problems if not taken care of. One small thing to mention before we move on to the cost. In regards to Sandslash, it's not uncommon for its spines and claws to fall out. Don't be alarmed by this, it's perfectly normal. It's just as the Sandslash digs and moves around, its claws and spines will become loose and fall off. In fact, once a year, your Sandslash will shed all of its old spines and allow new ones to grow in. This is fine, as they will regrow themselves within 24 hours of the spine or claw falling out. Really, this is just more of a heads up, hey, this might happen, don't freak out. Just when you notice that one has fallen out, just pick up the old one and get rid of it, then check to make sure that the new one is growing in fine with no complications. You might even be able to make a bit of money off of those shed spines and claws if you happen to know a farmer. They're usually sharp enough that many farmers use them as the blades for their plows. From what I understand, that's how many breeders that raise these Pokemon make a little bit of money on the side. And there isn't any reason that you couldn't do that if you have a Sandslash of your own. Cost. Overall, I put the Sandshrew line in the moderate or the high category. But That is because of the prices of the Pokemon, the food, and the enclosure are all going to be different levels of expensive. So when you average it out, it comes out to be around the moderate to high category. The good news about the enclosure is that there are companies out there that have prefabricated ones. You buy one of those and they get delivered straight to you. They will install it, fill it with the correct kind of soil, and get the temperature all set for you. Being able to just stand there and watch as someone else does all the hard work is a special kind of satisfaction. Only thing with that is that you will be paying quite a bit for it. But even if you decide to build the enclosure yourself, it's still going to end up being in the very high category, just because even the materials needed will cost quite a bit. The Pokemon itself, if you're getting it from a breeder, will be around the moderate category. With the expense of building the enclosure and the special nature of the environment that these Pokemon need to be kept in, many breeders up their prices a bit for the effort. If you find a breeder that lives in the environment that allows them to raise Sandshrew outside of an enclosure, then you might find one in the low category. But I don't think there are many of those, and the few that are out there probably have a long waiting list. However, if you're close to a spot where wild Sandshrew live, or are willing to put in the effort to get to one of those spots, then you could get one of these Pokemon for the price of a Pokeball. It's really a matter of if you are willing to put in the effort and possible travel time to save money on a breeder-raised one. I always suggest going with a breeder, as they're generally more even-tempered towards people, but then again, I'm biased. Food though, that will be about in the moderate or high category depending on what feeder you're going to give them. If you choose Dwebble, then it might be a bit more expensive. Because they live in the same kind of environment as Sandshrew, you need to set up the same kind of enclosure to raise them. So even though they are the natural prey of Sandshrew in the wild, they can be more expensive to feed your Pokemon. Instead, Caterpie, as we've discussed before on this show, is easy to raise and relatively cheap to get a hold of in bulk. The monthly cost of a Caterpie should be in the moderate category, and would be just as good for your Pokemon as Dwebble would. Conclusion. In my opinion, Pokemon like Sandshrew make dubious Pokemon to keep like this. The specialized environment that they need to stay healthy and happy makes them tough to keep if you don't live in certain places. Dedicating quite a bit of land to a building just for one Pokemon is a hefty investment. Plus the fact that they don't really interact with you very much, spending most of their time in the burrow, so they aren't like cuddly and cute Pokemon that you can play with all the time. It's more of a Pokemon that you feed and then don't really do anything with. So I personally don't think I'd get this Pokemon. But maybe you heard all this and it seems great to you. After all, if you don't have a lot of time to do the upkeep for a more demanding Pokemon, or just want something that you can feed and forget about, then this just might be the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Thank you all for tuning in, everyone, and please do so again next time when we cover the interesting case of extreme sexual dimorphism, the Nidoran line. Thank you, and have a wonderful night, everyone.